First, hundreds of years ago, the first social movement that we need to pay attention to was the rise of resistance among indigenous people against the settlers who came from imperial European powers, most famously in 1492, of course. The radical reform that might have been possible from that resistance to conquest was a call for coexistence or an Indian country, a kind of binational state in what's now the United States. And I've wondered why that was never achieved. And I think partly because the native people were overwhelmed by weapons, by disease, and by a constant replenishing of settlers. The native people were not unified into a nation state. They were tribal. But I also think it's because the concept of shared sovereignty between the indigenous and the occupiers was too radical to be reconciled with the notion of the American nation state having sovereignty over its terrain. There was a movement for Indian rights in addition to the resistance from De las Casas in the 16th century on into the 19th century. It was interwoven with the abolitionist movement, with the women's rights movement, with Quakers and religious groups and peace movements throughout the 19th century. It was defeated militarily and yet revived again in the 1960s and 1970s, and is far from over. It's been externalized, I would say, into battles between our government with indigenous people across the Americas, Asia, Africa, and it continues also to be a central issue in the battles over the identity of our culture here in North America. Second came the American Revolution. This was a national independence movement that succeeded in throwing the yoke of British colonialism off. The Declaration of Independence planted seeds that definitely contributed to larger movements and longer movements for equality, for abolition, for women's rights, for economic populism. And specifically, the Bill of Rights is the radical reform that I would identify as the most important result of social movements in the period following the Revolution, particularly the First Amendment. That was a concession by the elites to popular demands that those rights be added to the Constitution in order to gain ratification and build a nation state. The counter movement then employed the 1798 Alien and Sedition Acts, which authorized the deportation of so-called dangerous aliens. It criminalized so-called false, scandalous, and malicious writings. And that counter movement was only blocked during Jefferson's presidency. But that counter movement is a residual burning feature of our political landscape that arises periodically when the establishment is threatened, all the way through the centuries down to the Patriot Act of 2001. Next came the abolition of slavery and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. The movement in this case, I think, was the resistance movement, direct and indirect, by African slaves and free blacks against the slave system, a movement that W.E. Du Bois described as a general strike, a kind of a class terminology in which black workers gradually withdrew from the labor that was necessary to keep the slave economy going, and eventually joined the Underground Railroad, and then even the ranks of the Union Army in numbers up to 200,000, which were sufficient to bring down the Confederacy. The abolitionist movement, which is more remembered in our textbooks, really arose as an indirect and direct response to the slavery general strike or resistance. And the abolitionists carried out their movement with direct action, with public education, with electoral politics, a variety. Its most extreme representative would be, or symbolic representative, would be John Brown, who actually carried out guerrilla warfare against slavery and was eventually captured and executed after a failed attack at Harper's Ferry. We know that story. The other wing, the less extreme, but the political wing of the abolitionist movement, became the mainstream Republican Party known as the Radical Republicans. And they carried out an incredible electoral struggle back and forth, which eventually passed the Emancipation Proclamation, the amendments, the first Civil Rights Act, all the efforts subsequently at black suffrage, education, land reform, the promise of 40 acres and a mule, all of the policies known as radical Reconstruction. President Lincoln was the Machiavellian in the middle, a reformer whose state interest, Machiavellian interest, was the preservation of the Union on the basis of free labor instead of slave labor. By the way, he could not have been elected on any other basis. But when the Union cause was threatened on the battlefield, Lincoln initiated emancipation to draw those black people into the Union Army. And by the height of the war, the slaves, Frederick Douglass, the abolitionists, and Lincoln were in a common front. And remarkably, the Union Army was singing a battle hymn in the name of John Brown. The counter movement to Reconstruction and abolition was swift. It consisted first of a Confederate conspiracy to assassinate President Lincoln and assassinate Secretary of State Seward, who survived, on Good Friday, 1865, the very day that Lincoln had told his cabinet he wanted Reconstruction to include some sort of limited suffrage for black people. The second part of that counter movement was the steady retreat from Reconstruction under the vice president who succeeded the assassinated Lincoln. That was Andrew Johnson. The third phase was the so-called Compromise of 1876, in which Rutherford Hayes, the Republican candidate, became president by winning Southern electoral college votes in exchange for a promise to withdraw all the federal troops from the South, leaving black people in the South abandoned and defenseless. And finally, as those northern troops withdrew, the South carried out Jim Crow, black codes, massacres, decades of lynching of thousands of people by so-called redeemer groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And the counter movement, in other words, was long-lasting and devastating. The only thing I would point out is that it could not completely terminate abolition or the post-war amendments, which did become the historic and legal basis of 20th century civil rights struggles. The battle over the Civil War's memory continues now 250 years later after the assassination of Lincoln. Only since the 1960s, the civil rights movement, have we begun to restore and teach the history of the slave rebellions, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Robert Smalls, John Brown, and rewrite the story of black Reconstruction as a progressive reform effort. Lincoln has been elevated to the status of a redeeming god of sorts, but across much of the white South, as the newspapers tell us, slavery times have been repackaged and celebrated as states' rights and an honorable memory of a war against Northern aggression. It is no accident that Barack Obama is demonized and villainized most in the white precincts of the old Confederacy. Now, I want to touch on some other eras more briefly where movements have succeeded before coming to the present time. Let's take women's suffrage, a 100-year struggle, some would say longer, ending in 1919 with the right to vote, with suffrage. The tactics that were employed in this movement included public education, civil disobedience, lobbying the institutions, being chained to the White House fence, and sharp differences between moderates and radicals in the women's movement. But it was really only the Machiavellian crisis of World War I in which the U.S. government found itself promoting the idea of making the world safe for democracy, while feminists were chained to the White House fence and couldn't vote, which brought this to the head and forced Woodrow Wilson to make a choice and to change his mind in favor of the vote for women, and continued mass organizing from there, won the right to vote by exactly the 2/3 margin required in Congress and an equally narrow margin to ratify it. The counter-movement diluted the impact of the suffrage for several decades and blocked the passage of an Equal Rights Amendment down to the present time, but it couldn't block the resumption of the feminist movement in the 1960s. Let's look at labor in the New Deal, the 1930s. In light of today's big controversy in Wisconsin and other states over collective bargaining rights, we should remember how the Wagner Act, which officially inscribed those rights, came to be passed in 1935. The social movement of unorganized workers launched unauthorized strikes, sitting in on factory floors, and they were joined by progressives in the New Deal coalition that politically swept the congressional elections of 1934. The Popular Front pressured Roosevelt from the left, while corporatists and even fascists pressured from the right. The Machiavellian resolution was the New Deal, which raised incomes for many millions of people, legalized the organization of industrial unions, included unions in the new social compact, and implemented regulatory reforms of capitalism. Collective bargaining was actually not a radical change, but was part of the package. It was a compromise notion between the status quo of corporate rule and the eventuality of continuous wildcat strikes and disruptions on factory floors. So collective bargaining gave rights to workers, but it also was designed to stabilize the industrial system. Let's look at the 60s briefly. Zinn wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Never in American history have more movements for change been concentrated in so short a span of years." That is correct. Let me give you just an example from my book of things that we have forgotten were achieved in the 60s. Voting rights for Southern black people and for 18 to 21-year-olds, total of 26 million people. The end of the Indochina War, in which at least 2 million people, including 58,000 Americans, were killed. The end of the compulsory military draft. The fall of 2 presidents. New congressional checks on the imperial presidency, the CIA, and the FBI. Amnesty for 50,000 draft evaders who had gone to Canada. The Freedom of Information Act. The Media Fairness Doctrine. The 1973 Roe v. Wade decision. Tougher environmental, consumer, and health and safety laws, in my judgment, than any that have been passed since. Union rights for public sector employees. Reform of the presidential primary and delegate selection systems, and so on. The rights of disabled people were won by their employing of the same tactics of sit-ins and civil disobedience and political action and lobbying that won all the other rights that I'm identifying through our history.